I've seen quite a lot of nonsense in videos and comments regarding the DHL Swiftair 737 crash in Vilnius the other day. One example is this simple flying video heavily suggesting terrorism on the part of the Russians. Here's the portion of the video.
Now, at the time of video production, very little information is known about what happened. However, it's worth noting that previous Wall Street Journal reporting had revealed that a covert Russian operation had been sending incendiary devices on DHL planes over the summer. In July, one device caused a fire in a parcel warehouse in Germany and another in the UK. According to the publication, a fire at the DHL warehouse near Birmingham was caused by electric massagers implanted with a magnesium-based flammable material sent from Lithuania. As reported by LRT, the goal of this Russian operation was to figure out how to move these shipments and start fires on cargo or passenger planes flying to the US and Canada.
So he says nothing is known so far, and then dedicates nearly 25% of the video suggesting that it's a Russian plot. It always amazes me that these aviation YouTube channels put this stuff out without looking at the actual flight data that's readily available. Here is the ADS-B data showing the position, ground speed and altitude of the aircraft on the approach. This is the ILS Zulu runway 19 approach plate. We know that the clearance was to enter the procedure at MESOP, which leads you to the base leg, and then to the Victor India 412 fix, with a right turn to the final approach course. You'll see that MESOP has a speed and altitude restriction of 230 knots or below and 5,000 feet or above. Victor India 412 has a speed restriction of 210 knots and an altitude restriction of 3,000 feet or above. These airspeed restrictions are indicated airspeed limits, and the data that we have is ground speed, so there is some room for error, but we can see here that approaching MESOP, the start of the base leg, the aircraft is barreling in at a speed of nearly 300 knots ground speed. If they were in compliance with the speed restriction on the plate, that would need to be approaching a 70-knot tailwind component. Given the surface wind was less than 20 knots from the south, I don't think that's likely. Here's the weather reports from around the time of the accident. And you can see that the wind's consistently around southerly at around 15 to 17 knots. On the base leg here, we should be slowing down to 210 knots or below to comply with the next speed restriction. So to be honest, 210 knots at this point would be fairly fast. Most pilots would want to be slowing through around 190 knots with a knot or two of flaps to be comfortable. Another indication that the speed is excessive is the localizer overshoot. At slower speeds, the aircraft will turn onto the final approach track with 20 to 30 degrees angle of bank and capture the localizer without passing through the final approach. Here you can see that the aircraft blew straight through it, which means an excessive angle of bank would have been required to avoid this. And the reason for that is because the speed was excessive, and as the speed increases, so does the radius of the turn. So higher angle of banks would be required to maintain a tighter radius. So here's the aircraft's ADS-B data overlaid with the approach plate, the ILS Zulu procedure, starting at MESOP, which is over here. So you can see here that the MESOP has a max 230 knot speed restriction, as we discussed before, and a 5,000 or above altitude restriction. So we're making the altitude restriction no problem. In fact, they're probably struggling to get the aircraft down to the kind of altitude that they want at this stage. And we can see that as they're approaching MESOP, the speeds are around 300 knots over the ground. Starting to turn here at MESOP, we're doing 299 knots over the ground. So you can see that we are probably exceeding the 230 knots indicated airspeed restriction, unless we had around a 70 knot wind coming from here, which is unlikely, I would say, at this point. We then continue down the base leg, and you can see the speed slowly starting to bleed off, but nothing like what we'd want at this point. We'd probably want to be around 200 knots at this point, certainly not anywhere near 300. And we know that the speed restriction at the Victor India 412 point over here is 210 knots maximum speed. Normally, as I said, you'd want to be probably around 190 in order to make a nice comfortable turn onto the final there, and then think about configuring further. So really, in the 737 you'd probably want to be around flap 5 and around probably 190 knots at this point. And you can see what we're actually doing here is 258 knots over the ground. So again, it's about 60 knots more than we'd want. So the reason that this line comes out this way and then back in is because we overshoot the localizer. The reason for that is the excessive speed. Now, the line comes back in towards the final approach as we attempt to re-establish onto the localizer. This is the final approach fix for the approach procedure here, which is 6.2 miles from the airport. You'd really want to be established by then, at the latest, to be kind of comfortable, especially when you're in the clouds. But you can see that the line doesn't actually come back to the runway center line until about a mile after that, and this is about a 5 nautical mile final here. Now, if you were doing a sensible speed, it probably wouldn't be the end of the world. However, we're still doing 205 knots over the ground here, which is excessive, especially considering that the wind is coming from the south at around 17 knots, which means that the indicated airspeed here is probably a good 220 knots. So that means that they're going to be struggling to configure the aircraft to the final approach configuration due to the excessive speed, meaning they might not be able to get the flaps out that they want. So here the workload is going to be very, very, very high, and they're going to be struggling to catch up with what they need to get done before they land. Now, it also doesn't help that there was some issues with contacting the tower, so the aircraft doesn't actually ever contact the tower, and we know that the frequency was read back wrong. So probably what the situation that you're getting into here is that one pilot is wondering why he can't contact the tower. The other pilot's probably glancing over to try and help him out and figure out why he's having trouble. But at the same time, that's the pilot flying. He's going to be quite concentrating on getting the speed back and configuring the aircraft for landing to avoid the go-around situation. Probably somewhere in all that confusion, we've ended up with an aircraft that's not configured correctly, and then an undesired aircraft state. And that is definitely the most likely cause of the accident here. And I can't see any reason why you'd suspect terrorism or sabotage in this situation. It looks like a high energy approach gone wrong.